At its height, the Roman Empire was not merely a military superpower, it was the financial center of the known world. From the windswept frontiers of Britannia to the deserts of Syria, Rome commanded trade routes, taxation systems, and a monetary network that bound together millions of people under a single economic order. Silver flowed into its treasuries. Tribute arrived from conquered provinces. Merchants conducted business in a currency trusted across continents. To live under Rome was to live within one of history's most formidable financial systems. And yet, this empire, so vast, so organized, so disciplined, would ultimately unravel. Not in a single dramatic collapse, but in a slow erosion of confidence, credibility, and fiscal control. The legions did not suddenly vanish. The Senate did not simply dissolve. Instead, the foundations of Roman power began to weaken in a place less visible than the battlefield, in its money. How does an empire that commands the Mediterranean, that builds roads across 3 continents, that standardizes law and taxation across cultures and languages, run out of money? How does a system designed to extract wealth from the world become unable to sustain itself? These questions matter because Rome's decline was not a mystery of fate or superstition. It was a financial story, a story of rising costs, strained revenues, and decisions that traded long-term stability for short-term survival. At its peak, Rome perfected a model of imperial finance. Conquest generated treasure. New territories provided land, slaves, and taxable populations. Expansion paid for expansion. Each victory funded the next campaign, while strengthening the state's monetary credibility. The silver denarius became more than a coin, it became a symbol of order. Soldiers trusted it. Traders relied on it. Provinces paid taxes in it. Rome's authority rested not only on the sword, but on the stability of its currency. But empires face a structural dilemma. Expansion cannot continue indefinitely. Borders eventually stabilize. Military victories yield diminishing financial returns. When territorial growth slows, the financial engine that once sustained the system begins to falter. Costs, however, rarely decline. Armies must still be paid. Roads must be maintained. Bureaucrats must administer distant provinces. The machinery of empire does not shrink simply because revenues plateau. This is where the tension begins, the silent gap between income and obligation. For Rome, that gap widened over decades. Defense spending increased as threats along the frontiers intensified. Administrative complexity grew as the empire expanded geographically. The state required more revenue at precisely the moment its easiest sources of wealth were drying up. History often remembers Rome's fall through images of invading tribes and collapsing walls. Yet long before the frontiers gave way, something more fundamental had begun to fracture: financial discipline. Political leaders faced pressure to maintain stability, satisfy the army, and reassure the population. The temptation to manipulate the monetary system in order to ease immediate strain grew stronger. This is not simply an ancient story. It is a recurring pattern in the history of empires. Monetary credibility underpins political authority. When the currency is strong, confidence spreads. When it weakens, uncertainty multiplies. The Roman Empire's decline forces us to confront a difficult truth: military dominance cannot indefinitely compensate for fiscal imbalance. Rome's downfall was not merely the triumph of external enemies. It was the cumulative consequence of financial decisions made under pressure, decisions that gradually undermined the very system that had made Rome powerful. To understand how the Roman Empire was bankrupted is to understand how money and power are inseparable, and how the erosion of one inevitably destabilizes the other. To understand how Rome drifted towards bankruptcy, we must first understand how its financial system actually worked. The Roman Empire was not sustained by plunder alone. It was supported by a structured monetary regime, an organized taxation system, and a sophisticated administrative network that bound distant provinces into a single economic sphere. At the center of this system stood the silver denarius. Introduced during the Republic, it became the backbone of imperial commerce. Its consistent silver content gave it credibility far beyond Italy. From North Africa to Gaul, merchants accepted it with confidence. Soldiers were paid in it. Taxes were assessed in it. The coin was not merely a medium of exchange, it was the glue that held the imperial economy together. Rome's early fiscal strength rested on expansion. Conquest generated extraordinary windfalls. Victorious generals brought home treasure, precious metals, and enslaved labor. Newly annexed territories paid tribute and taxes. Agricultural estates expanded. Trade routes multiplied. In effect, territorial growth financed state expenditure. The imperious budget was supplemented by the spoils of war, creating the illusion of inexhaustible wealth. But this model contained an inherent fragility. It relied on continuous outward movement. When expansion slowed in the 2nd century, the financial arithmetic changed. The imperious borders reached natural limits. Further conquest became more costly and less profitable. Defensive warfare replaced lucrative campaigns. Revenues stabilized, but expenditures did not. The Roman state carried heavy fixed costs. The standing army, often numbering over 300,000 men, required regular pay, equipment, pensions, and supply chains stretching across continents. Infrastructure demanded maintenance, roads, aqueducts, fortifications, ports. Provincial administration required governors, tax collectors, and legal officials. The imperial machine consumed vast resources simply to function. Without fresh inflows of conquest wealth, Rome increasingly relied on taxation. Provinces were assessed according to land, production, and population. While efficient in theory, tax collection became more burdensome over time. Local elites were made responsible for gathering revenue, often absorbing shortfalls themselves. As economic conditions deteriorated in some regions, extracting reliable tax income became more difficult and more coercive. Faced with mounting pressure, emperors turned to a powerful but dangerous tool, currency debasement. By gradually reducing the silver content in the denarius while maintaining its face value, the state effectively created more coins from the same amount of metal. In the short term, this expanded the money supply and allowed the government to meet immediate obligations, particularly military payroll. However, this strategy carried predictable consequences. As the intrinsic silver value of coins declined, trust began to erode. Merchants recognized the reduction in purity. Prices adjusted upward. Soldiers demanded higher pay to compensate for diminished purchasing power. What began as a subtle adjustment evolved into a cycle of inflation. By the 3rd century, the silver content of the denarius had fallen dramatically. Coins that once contained nearly pure silver were now composed largely of base metals with a thin silver wash. Confidence deteriorated accordingly. In some regions, people hoarded older, purer coins and rejected newer issues. Monetary fragmentation emerged, undermining the uniformity that had once strengthened the empire. Meanwhile, to offset currency weakness, taxation intensified. The state attempted to extract more real resources from a population already strained by instability. Bureaucracy expanded to enforce compliance. Economic vitality declined as producers faced heavier burdens and uncertain currency value. The Roman financial system thus entered a precarious equilibrium, rising military costs, stagnant revenues, expanding money supply, and declining trust. The very mechanisms that once underpinned Rome's power, its reliable currency, its disciplined taxation, its structured administration, were being distorted under fiscal stress. This was not a sudden collapse, but a structural transformation. Rome shifted from a system financed by growth and credibility to one sustained by monetary manipulation and increasing coercion. In doing so, it laid the groundwork for deeper instability, the kind that no army, however disciplined, could permanently suppress. As the integrity of Rome's monetary system weakened, the consequences began to ripple outward through every layer of imperial life. Inflation was no longer an abstract phenomenon confined to treasuries and mints, it became a daily reality for soldiers, merchants, landowners, and laborers. Prices rose not because prosperity was expanding, but because trust in the currency was dissolving. The army felt the strain first. Legionaries who had once been paid in reliable silver discovered that their wages purchased less grain, less clothing, and fewer essentials. To maintain loyalty, emperors increased nominal pay. Yet this solution only accelerated the cycle. More debased coins were minted to meet higher payroll demands, further eroding purchasing power. What had begun as a temporary fiscal adjustment hardened into a structural inflationary spiral. Merchants responded rationally. They raised prices or demanded payment in goods rather than coin. In some provinces, barter re-emerged as confidence in imperial money faltered. Economic fragmentation followed. A unified monetary zone, once one of Rome's greatest strengths, began to fracture into regional systems of exchange. The smooth circulation of commerce slowed. At the same time, external pressures intensified. Germanic tribes along the Rhine and Danube became more organized and more assertive. In the east, the Sasanian Empire posed a formidable military challenge. Defense costs climbed sharply. Fortifications were expanded. Troop numbers increased. The empire was spending more to protect a system that was generating less surplus. To bridge the growing gap between obligation and income, taxation grew heavier and more rigid. Provincial populations bore the burden. Land taxes were fixed regardless of harvest conditions. Occupational groups were bound more tightly to their roles to ensure revenue continuity. Farmers were increasingly tied to their land, foreshadowing later forms of serfdom. The state prioritized predictable extraction over economic flexibility. These shifts carried long-term consequences. Taxation discouraged production and investment. Small landholders abandoned farms they could no longer sustain. Large estates consolidated power, often negotiating favorable arrangements with authorities. Urban centers, once vibrant hubs of trade, experienced gradual contraction. Economic vitality narrowed even as administrative demands expanded. Political instability compounded the financial strain. The 3rd century witnessed a succession of short-lived emperors, many elevated by military support and removed by force. Each new ruler faced immediate pressure to reward the troops who secured his position. Financial prudence rarely survived such circumstances. Loyalty was purchased with bonuses, donatives, and promises of higher pay, commitments funded through further debasement or increased taxation. This was a dangerous feedback loop. Political fragility encouraged fiscal recklessness deepened economic instability weakened political authority. The empire entered what historians often call the crisis of the 3rd century, but beneath the military upheavals lay a profound monetary exhaustion. Even attempts at reform revealed the scale of the problem. Emperor Diocletian, at the end of the 3rd century, introduced sweeping administrative and monetary changes. He sought to stabilize prices through edicts and reorganize taxation to secure state revenue. Yet price controls could not restore trust, and expanding bureaucracy increased administrative costs. Reform slowed the descent but did not fully restore earlier financial discipline. By this stage, Rome was no longer financing prosperity, it was financing survival. The state's resources were directed toward maintaining order rather than fostering growth. Its currency no longer symbolized confidence but necessity. The empire that once expanded through economic strength was now straining under the weight of its own commitments. The turning point was not a single invasion or dramatic battle. It was the gradual realization that Rome's financial foundations had been compromised. When money loses credibility, power becomes reactive rather than strategic. The empire remained formidable in appearance, but internally it was operating on diminishing fiscal reserves, a condition that left it vulnerable to shocks it might once have absorbed with ease. The story of Rome's financial decline is not merely an ancient curiosity, it is a recurring pattern in the history of money and power. Empires rise on credible currency, disciplined taxation, and productive economic systems. They decline when those foundations are quietly compromised. Rome's experience reveals that military dominance, administrative sophistication, and territorial scale cannot indefinitely compensate for fiscal imbalance. At its height, Rome's strength lay in trust. The silver in its coinage carried authority because it represented real value. Taxation functioned because economic activity was sufficiently vibrant to sustain it. Expansion created surplus, and surplus funded stability. The impetus political power and its monetary credibility reinforced one another. But once expansion slowed and obligations continued to rise, Rome faced a choice familiar to later powers: reform expenditure, increase revenue honestly, or manipulate the currency. Debasement offered the path of least immediate resistance. It allowed emperors to meet payroll, fund defenses, and maintain appearances. Yet the long-term cost was the erosion of confidence, and confidence is the invisible infrastructure of any monetary system. History demonstrates that reserve currencies and dominant financial systems depend not merely on force, but on belief. When citizens, soldiers, and traders begin to doubt the stability of money, behavior changes. Prices adjust. Contracts shorten. Hoarding replaces investment. Economic horizons shrink. The state finds itself compelled to exert greater coercion to extract the same resources once provided willingly. Power becomes defensive rather than expansive. The broader pattern is striking. Empires often experience a phase where growth masks structural weaknesses. Revenue from expansion conceals inefficiencies. Borrowing, monetary expansion, or resource windfalls delay difficult adjustments. Yet when growth plateaus, those weaknesses become visible. Rising military costs, demographic shifts, and administrative complexity strain fiscal systems. Leaders under pressure frequently choose short-term relief over long-term credibility. Rome's decline illustrates that financial erosion is rarely dramatic at first. It unfolds incrementally. A slight reduction in silver content. A modest increase in taxation. A temporary pay rise for the army. Each decision appears manageable in isolation. Together, over decades, they alter the character of the state. Monetary discipline gives way to expediency. Fiscal balance yields to political survival. For students of UK finance history and the evolution of the British Empire economy, the lesson is not simplistic comparison but structural awareness. The pound sterling, like the denarius before it, derived strength from trust, trade, and institutional credibility. Britain's global influence rested not solely on naval power, but on the reliability of its financial system. The endurance of any currency depends on responsible governance, manageable debt cycles, and productive capacity. Rome reminds us that debt cycles and monetary expansion can sustain power for a time, but they cannot replace underlying economic vitality. When expenditure consistently exceeds sustainable revenue, the state must either reform, retrench, or debase. Each path carries consequences. Debasement, though politically convenient, gradually transfers costs to the broader population through inflation and lost confidence. Ultimately, the Roman Empire did not collapse because it lacked soldiers or walls. It faltered because its monetary foundations weakened under cumulative strain. Its authority eroded not only at the borders, but within its own fiscal architecture. Money and power are inseparable. When one is destabilized, the other cannot remain secure. The enduring lesson is sober rather than sensational. Empires decline when they sacrifice long-term monetary credibility for short-term stability. Financial discipline is not merely an economic virtue, it is a cornerstone of political longevity. Rome's story is therefore not simply about the ancient world. It is a reminder that the health of any great power is written first in the strength and integrity of its money.